Welcome, everyone. My name is Stacy Davis. I'm with the Missouri Department of Conservation here in Kansas City. And hopefully you're in the right spot for greening vacant land with native plants as bee habitat. As we get started today, and as we go through the session, just don't forget the chat feature is on the right-hand side of your screen. Just go ahead and put in any comments, questions you have as we go through the session. And then at the end, I'll read those to the presenter and we'll try to work our way through at least most of the questions, if not all of them, before the end of the session. So now I'd like to welcome Dr. Mary Gardiner. Dr. Gardiner is an associate professor in the Department of Entomology at The Ohio State University. Her research focuses on the ecological value of urban vacant land in Cleveland, Ohio, a city that has experienced significant economic and population decline. Cleveland currently contains 27,000 vacant lots, totaling approximately 4,000 acres of land. The Gardiner Lab examines how alternative vegetation designs and management regimes influence the value of vacant land for the conservation of biodiversity and the provision of ecosystem services. So welcome, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Well, hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here to talk with you and to share some of my research focused on vacant land. So I am a professor in the entomology department. So I study beneficial insects like lady beetles and pollinators. And today we'll be talking about the value of vacant land for bees specifically. As a professor of entomology, in my particular job, the majority of what I do is research with graduate students. So that's about 85% of my job. And I study the ecology of many different types of green spaces. In addition to vacant lots, we work with residents in backyards, in parks, rain gardens, and other habitats. We're interested in the design and management of these habitats and also how their landscape context influences their value for insects. And we do quite a bit of work with heavy metal pollution, which is a big deal in post-industrial cities like Cleveland. So I'll be talking to you some about that today as well. I get to work with some great up-and-coming new scientists. So these are all graduate students in my lab currently. And I also get to do a lot of outreach like this presentation today. One of the nice things about being at a land-grant institution is you have that opportunity. So I work with master gardener groups. We've recently done the Ohio 4-H curriculum, and I do a lot of community or citizen science programming. I also teach courses in grant writing, insect ecology, and presentation skills. My students often come to my presentations, and I think they see whether I follow all the steps in our rubric. So hopefully this is not a terrible presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and get into my content here. So many people are surprised to learn just how diverse the bee fauna is in the Midwestern US. So Ohio alone has 500 species of bees. And this is similar across other states, sort of within the region, that you're going to find between 400 and 600 species of bees. And surprisingly, about 20% of those bees live in cities. So we find a large proportion of Ohio's bees using urban habitat. And this 500 species of bees is a diverse group. So not all these bees make their living in the same way. They raise their young in different ways. They have different types of plants that they visit. And so I wanted to kind of give you an overview of some of the major groups of bees that we're going to be talking about when I talk about insect diversity in this presentation. So insect diversity, bee diversity is made in Ohio is made up of many different types of bees, including several species of bumblebees in the genus Bombus. Many of these bees are native to the state of Ohio, and they are a social bee. So in a social bee system, you have a queen who lays eggs and larvae develop, and those larvae develop into workers, and then those workers start to grow the colony by foraging for pollen and nectar, bringing those resources back, and also raising the next generation of bee larvae that queen lays. The colony does not overwinter, so only the queen overwinters. So they do not store honey like a bumblebee would or a honeybee would over the winter, they only collect and store enough resources they need for their larvae. And what you're seeing in this picture at the bottom is a bumblebee colony. You can see that there are worker bees foraging or working around the nest. Those open cells are honey pots full of pollen and nectar, and the closed cells are pupae, where pupae are developing. These bees nest in the ground. They will nest in old rodent burrows or other holes in the ground, and some bumblebee species are threatened or rare. The majority of the 500 bee species in Ohio are made up of solitary bees. Solitary bees consist of a female that provisions her own nest, so they do not cooperate together to raise their offspring. The solitary bees include many native species and also some non-native introduced bees. These are not aggressive, so oftentimes people don't even realize some of these bees are bees. When they see them, they think they might be flies or something else, such as sweat bees, because they are small and they are very docile. You would have to grab a female and kind of squish it really to get it to sting you. And these also range from pretty common in the environment to very rare, depending on the species. Many beautiful patterns and colors as well. Within the solitary bees, there are many different guilds that have different types of traits. One guild are the mining species. These are bees that burrow in the soil. So here we have an andrenid, and below this soil, if you were able to look what's happening, there's a tunnel, and this female will put pollen and nectar down in that hole and lay an egg on it, and that egg will develop into a pupa, which will eventually emerge the next summer from that, or spring from the soil. And similar for this Lacioglossom. So sometimes people see these nests in their yard and think it's ants or wasps or spiders or something in there, and it's actually cavity or soil nesting bees. There are also carpenter bees, which nest in wood, and other types of bees that nest in pithy stems, like raspberry stems. And there are bees that nest in pre-existing cavities. These could be old beetle burrows, like in this log that has some insect damage. This little bee is going in there to deposit its offspring. And here's what that looks like inside. You have all of these different cells. Each one has pollen and nectar and a tiny egg that will develop into a bee pupa by eating all of this food as a larva and then pupating right inside the log. There are also leaf cutter bees, which cut leaves and take them back to a nest. And those bees line their nest with that leaf material. So these bees are doing a lot of things in the environment to raise their offspring, a lot of different things. And so because of that, they need different types of resources. And many of those resources are challenged by urbanization. Unfortunately, as we build out our environment as people, that leads to the decline of many types of plants and animals. We know that habitat fragmentation is a major driver of biodiversity loss. And so we would predict that as we have denser and denser cities, the bee community would have a reduced taxonomic richness, so fewer species, more exotic or introduced bees, and more generalists that can use a lot of different types of flowers for pollen and nectar, because they may not be able to, specialist bees may not be able to find the specific host plants that they would need within a challenging environment like this. But bees do not always follow scientific predictions. So when you look across an urban to rural gradient, when we go from the countryside into a dense city, sometimes bees will have a greater richness and abundance outside the city, as we would predict. But just as many studies have found that bee species richness actually increases as we move into an urban area or stays the same. So why is there this variation? Well, cities are really different. Some of them have high population densities. Some of them have a lot more green space than others. They vary in size and age and things. And all of those factors can influence their quality as habitat for pollinators. And over the last 15 years or so, I've studied a particular type of city, shrinking cities. So there are over 450 shrinking cities across the globe. And in the United States, many of these are located within the Midwestern and Eastern US, one of which is the city of Cleveland. Cleveland, Ohio is located on Lake Erie in northeast Cleveland. It was once the 5th largest city in the US, but Cleveland has lost more than 50% of its population due to changes in the economic situation in Cleveland and job opportunities. Many people have left inner city areas for a number of different reasons. And so you have a lot more infrastructure than you actually need. What happens to that infrastructure is it is eventually torn down, creating vacant lots. The city of Cleveland has over 30,000 vacant lots, or about 2,000 hectares of vacant land. So the city is shown here in gray, and all of the green areas within the city were historic parks like the Metro Park system and city parks. All of the red areas were once either industrial sites or individual houses, which have been torn down, adding green space in the form of vacant land back to the city. And you can see, especially on the east side, this has created a large number of green space patches that vary in size and shape. And this is what this looks like on the ground. So as you drive around inner city neighborhoods of Cleveland, there are many boarded up homes which have been foreclosed or abandoned. These homes are eventually torn down by the city. The sites are then graded and seeded with fescue grass and mown monthly. And what that creates is a weedy habitat with a lot of bee forage, with a lot of floral resources. And so when I first started in this position, I was very interested in whether this could create valuable habitat for bees. And I was interested in trying to address the needs of the bees while also paying attention to the needs that people would have within vacant lots. Because these, of course, are within the shadow of where people are still living. They're not isolated environments. And so over the course of several years, we conducted a project to determine how we could best manage vacant lots to support bees and healthy communities within Cleveland. This project was called the Cleveland Pocket Prairie Project. It was a 7-year project, and it occurred across the city. It was unique among many field studies in that we did this in actual vacant lots in neighborhoods across the city. We had 4 different treatments that we examined, and 8 sites of each, so 40 total vacant lots. And the treatments I'm going to talk to you about are a control treatment. In the control treatment, we left the sites as the city does. So we left the existing vegetation. We continue to mow once a month like the city does. Then we also had a meadow treatment. So one of the first things people will try when they want to create bee habitat is to just stop mowing. And that's a recommendation you hear from conservation groups. And so we wanted to see, well, what would happen if we did that? We also established a low-growing flowering lawn. This consisted of turf grass and exotic low-growing plants, and what we called a pocket prairie. And this was a tall native grass and forb seed mix. So here are some pictures of what the treatments look like. This is our control lot, cut monthly. This is our meadow, cut annually. This is our flowering lawn, and this is the pocket prairie. We obviously did not burn these prairies like you would in a rural place. And so a pocket prairie in a city will be a combination of both weedy species and the species that you planted. So how did we establish these pocket prairies in these tiny vacant lots? The first thing I would suggest you do is, if you're a scientist or a nonprofit organization, but not an expert in native plants, I would not do this yourself because it's very visible to the public. So you want it to work the first time. So the first thing I did, which really went well, was I hired a company called Ohio Prairie Nursery, which is an excellent organization in our area. And they established the flowering lawn and prairie sites. And the way that they did this was they herbicided each site 3 times. That is controversial within the conservation world. We did this because this was an experiment. We needed to establish a best case prairie habitat. And we had an incredible seed bank and needed to do this within a year in a bunch of sites. So solarization and other tactics were not possible for us, but that certainly would be an option. We then lightly tilled the site to incorporate compost and micronutrients in the fall and broadcast seeded. The flowering lawn was mown monthly. After that, even though it was supposed to be a no-mow treatment, we found that the red clover took over to such an extent that we had to continue mowing to have a diversity of flowers. The pocket prairie was mown monthly the first year, to try to reduce weed pressure, and then annually after that. So the first big question was, will the plants establish? So this is what the site looked like right after we broadcast seeded. It took 3 full years to have it bloom. So here we are in 2017. So from 2014 to 17, it looked like a tall field of weeds and nothing else. And you can imagine you will get a lot of phone calls about what's going on with that site. So that's something to be aware of when doing something like this. I'm sure people want to know what we planted in the site. So for the flowering lawn, we used a commercial product called the Florida Lawn Seed Mix. It had many different types of seeds within the seed mix. We did see establishment of all of these plants. So in this box, I have everything that was in the seed mix. And then in this box, everything that established. We did get establishment of all of the plants. However, after 1 year, we really had these move to a dominant clover habitat. So the white clover and strawberry clover really kind of took over. What did we plant in the pocket prairie? I went with a diverse seed mix in the pocket prairie, which was based on 2 things. One, I used recommended seed lists from a number of organizations, including the Xerces Society and Michigan State University, who had published bee attractive plant mixes that would bloom from very early in the spring till late in the fall. I wanted to have that seasonality aspect, both for bees and for our neighbors, that there'd always be color as long as we could maintain it within the lots. But not all of these plant species bloomed. So here in this box, and feel free to take a photo if you want a copy of this. This is the plants that we actually had established, and those in bold established in all of my 8 sites of this treatment. And we had a lot of weeds, and that's something to be aware of and to talk to your clientele about. These are some pictures of some of the plants that established in the pocket prairie. Very beautiful. And this is what it kind of looked like all together. As I said, we have some Queen Anne's, some chicory, some coneflower, and some bee balm all growing in harmony here in this vacant lot. So what did we do? Well, we established these treatments. Then we had to see, well, does it matter what we planted? Do bees forage differently in these different habitats? Do we find different types of bees using these spaces? So we used a couple of techniques to be able to survey the types of bees that were there. The first thing that we did was observations. So we observed every plant that was blooming within a vacant lot for 5 minutes, and we collected all of the bee species that landed on it. We also put out passive traps that mimic flowers that have soapy water, and we did that once a month. We did this for a couple of years to be able to understand what types of bees were in these sites. So one of our first questions was, does stopping mowing vacant lots improve their quality as bee habitat? This would be the least expensive, easiest conservation practice you could do. It costs $3 million a year for Cleveland to mow all these lots. What happens if we stopped doing that? Well, we predicted, based on this being a recommendation, that there would be a greater number of bee species in the meadow than the control. But actually, we found the opposite. The control vacant lot actually had a greater species richness of bees compared to the meadow treatment. Monthly mowing actually maintained a higher flower abundance than annual mowing. The annual mowed sites became very grass dominated, and this is very representative here in this photo. The other thing I will say is that, so it was bad for bees. Stopping mowing did not improve bee habitat. And this is something I have had to say to people a ton of times because people have wanted to just fight me on this point. But I promise you, mowing weeds promotes bloom of things like clover and chicory. Not every week, though. The other thing I would say is that it was not going, even if the meadow treatment was amazing bee habitat, people universally hated it. We got many angry phone calls. When are you going to mow this site? So it's just not a habitat that works well within an urban setting where you have a lot of people living. So meadow treatment, not so great. Now, when I tell people, well, when we mowed once a month, it maintained a good quality of bee habitat, they say, well, what if we increase that even more and mow once a week? That would look really, really nice. Well, eventually you're going to remove all the floral resources, right? So this is also not going to be good for bees. So our conservation takeaway from this first question is that a lazy lawnmower approach of monthly mowing is really a great way to manage vacant land to promote bees and blooms. Now the next question was, okay, so meadows, not so great, but we did plant these two different types of treatments that are specifically for pollinators. So did we see increased bee richness in either the flowering lawn or the pocket prairie? And surprisingly, we found all three of these were good for bees. All of these had a higher species richness of bees compared to the meadow, but there was not a significant difference in the species richness among these treatments. What we did see is that when sites had a lot of flowers, whether they were red clover or coneflower, we saw increased bee richness. So it was really more about maintaining high bloom abundance and bloom richness than it was about particular types of flowers. And many people might see this as a negative, but actually, if you think about vacant land and all of the challenges in maintaining conservation habitat, this is actually a good thing that we can recommend to people. Like if you want to plant a pocket prairie in a particular site that you manage, it will be good for bees. But if you don't have the budget for that, but you still want to be part of bee conservation, all you have to do is maintain your vacant lot and maintain the flowers that are there, and that matters. And I think that that really opens the door for more people to participate in conservation, which is something we all need to be looking at doing, right? So our conservation takeaway here is that it's not the number of flowers, it is the number of flowers, not the type, that is most important for our urban bees. But just finding bees doesn't mean they're doing well. You can't ask a bee, so how's your health? Do you have a lot of offspring? How are they doing? We actually have to measure that, right? So the other thing we wanted to do, in addition to looking at how abundant the bees were, is that we wanted to see how successful they were at reproducing and whether the habitats that we planted, if that aided their reproduction in any way. So we looked at the nesting of one of those species that I talked about early in the program, those cavity nesting bees, specifically Osmia, which is a type of cavity nesting bee. And you can study Osmia by putting out little trap nests that contain paper straws that mimic the types of cavities that they would go in nature. And female bees will nest in these straws. And this is actually an X-ray of a straw. And you can see each one of the cells, and each cell has pollen. And then next to the pollen is a larva. And you can tell that this one down here was the first one to be deposited because it's the biggest. And then down here, we have a brand new egg that's just been laid. So what we did was we put out these trap nests in all of our sites, and we then X-rayed the straws to see how many native bee larvae there were in them, to see whether there were more in the sites with the pocket prairies versus the control sites. And we actually did see that the pocket prairies increased the reproductive success of our bees. So here we have native larvae in the control treatment, the flowering lawn, and the pocket prairie. So here you see this increasing relationship with the flowering lawn not being statistically different than the control, but having some improvement. And then the pocket prairie being significantly different from the control site and having a higher bee reproduction. So this is really important. So our takeaway here is that native plants are valuable for urban bee reproduction. So thinking about peppering these sites throughout a city will be a great way to make sure that bees have those resources they need to have a high reproductive success. Now, the next thing we looked at is, well, when you have 30,000 lots, you have a lot of choices in terms of where you might put a conservation habitat. And if you're a conservation group trying to decide, there might be a lot of political or social reasons for picking one site or the other. So those are certainly valid considerations. But there's also ecological reasons that you might pick one site versus another. One being, how easy is it for bees to be able to get to your site? Or how many habitats are already present in that landscape? Is it sufficient to provide a habitat? So there are instances where vacant lots are individual sites and they're surrounded on all sides by houses, Then there are other habitats where you might have a whole city block that's vacant. So what you're seeing in this picture, each one of these little cut-ins used to be somebody's driveway. So this is a big plot of land. So we wondered, does the context matter here? So what we did was we worked with the city of Cleveland to get land cover data for each one of the vacant lots that we planted. So here's our vacant lot in the middle, and then we analyzed the land cover up to 1 kilometer away from our site, and we determined the amount of habitat that was pavement in gray or buildings in red, and then the amount that was some kind of green space like tree cover in dark green or grass and shrubs in light green. And we had some landscapes where the green cover was very connected, meaning all the green cover kind of connected into lines. And if you were a little insect trying to navigate that landscape, that would make your life easier if there was always green cover. In other landscapes, they were very isolated. So here, this vacant lot, yeah, it has a little bit of green around it, but mostly the insects are going to have to get through a lot of pavement and a lot of houses to get to our habitat. And so we predicted that habitats that were in these connected landscapes might actually get more use than habitats that were in these really isolated landscapes. These might be such a big barrier to overcome that planting here may not result in a high bee use of a habitat. So we looked at this, and what we found was when vacant lots had connected green space around, we did find more bee species using the site. We also found a larger proportion of tiny bee species, and this makes sense because if you think about for small bees, they may not be able to fly over roads as easily as like a large carpenter bee. We also found greater reproductive success of our native bees. So in addition to the pocket prairies influencing reproductive success, planting those prairies in landscapes with lots of other green cover around increased the reproductive success as well. So our takeaway here is to target areas near other vacant lots or other parks or large green spaces. You're going to get a better result in terms of providing high quality habitat to kind of double down and improve those already connected habitats to begin with, which is maybe a little counterintuitive to what we might think. So this is all very good. We're going out, we're planting into these vacant lots, moving forward, thinking about ways to reinvigorate urban development following this major change in the city. But we have to also look at the past to be able to understand the quality of this habitat. And so if we think back to what Cleveland used to be, it was an industrial city. It was a leader in iron and steel production. And what we see now is the effect of that. So now it's a post-industrial city, and it unfortunately has quite a bit of heavy metal contamination. And one of the first projects we did was we put out bumblebee colonies across an urban to rural gradient from Cleveland down to one of OSU's research stations in Worcester, Ohio, which is a small town in a rural county. And what we found when we collected the bumblebees from those colonies was that the ones in the city had collected heavy metals, and they had heavy metals in their pollen and nectar, whereas the ones in the rural places did not. And so our question was, well, just because something has lead in its body doesn't necessarily mean that that has a negative consequence for health. We actually have to test that, right? So what we did was we took the concentrations of pollen and nectar that were in, or of heavy metals that were in this pollen and nectar that we collected from the field. And then we flew bees in tents and only allowed them to eat food with that concentration of heavy metals. And it was very low. I will say it was very low. And I sort of worried that I hoped we wouldn't get a response, but I also was worried because this was a PhD student project that if she got no data, that I had told her to do a ridiculous experiment. Because when we put the heavy metals in, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like nothing compared to the amount of pollen and nectar. But unfortunately, even with that very low dose that we found in the city, we did see increased mortality of the bee larvae in those hives. So in control environments where bees just fed sugar water, they did have mortality. There was about 20%. So you have to look at the difference between that mortality and what happens when they were fed Cleveland levels of these heavy metals. So for arsenic, cadmium, chromium, and lead, which are the four most common metals that we find, we had between a 3 or 4 times increase in mortality. When they were fed all metals, which might seem crazy, but often heavy metals co-occur, and we did find hives with high concentrations of all metals in the field, you have 9 times the mortality. And this is just showing you what it looks like. This is the healthy bee larvae and a dead bee larvae. So our takeaway here is not to be afraid of this, but it is to acknowledge it. So heavy metal contamination is something that can be overcome. The first thing that you'll want to do is to soil test your site and any nearby habitats with a lot of flowering resources and avoid contaminated sites. We're also working, I always get the question, well, what can we do? Is it very expensive? Well, there are some very expensive ways to remediate soil, but there are also some not very expensive soil blends that you can add. And one of my projects right now is to develop a low cost natural blend of materials that can be added to soil. We're looking at a bunch of different blends that include things like poultry litter, ash material, biosolids that will bind the heavy metals and prevent them from moving into food webs. So stay tuned. Maybe I can come back and talk about that to a group like this, but it certainly will be on our website in the future when we get that figured out. So those are kind of some of our conservation takeaways from our research for the bees, but I want to finish up by talking about how communities can approach urban bee conservation. So one thing that I hear all the time from people who are very passionate about bees is that, well, people will just figure out, they will accept this over time. This is important, so I'm going to do this. And people don't get it, and they don't understand why this is important, so I'm just going to do it. And if you take that approach, I can tell you that you're going to go out to your site one day, not soon after establishing it, and it will be mowed down. Your fence will be gone. The whole thing will be destroyed because people don't like to be told to accept stuff. You don't like that. I don't like that either. And it's the wrong way to go about community greening. As ecologists and conservation leaders, we need to be thinking about ways to work with the community to develop these habitats. So one thing that is not that shocking, but that I still found out as a new researcher was that at the time that I planted this project, there was a ton of work going on with sustainable greening. And one of the big themes in gardening was planting native plants. And so we really thought that most people would have heard about native plants. Around each one of our sites, we canvassed an entire block and we talked about what we were going to do. Would people be on board with this? But unfortunately, there's such high turnover in the renters that live in the neighborhoods around where we were working, it was very challenging to keep everyone up to date. And as a result, we got a lot of complaints about tall vegetation, the meadow treatment, but also the pocket prairie treatment. And I talk about this in length in these two publications, which I would be happy to send if folks don't have access to the literature. But we got a lot of complaints, and even residents will also call on the city. So this is a news story. This isn't about my sites, but this is in the early spring. The city wasn't able to mow because it was very wet, and people were calling and saying the grass is too tall. And if you look in the back, there's a huge patch of milkweed, and it's just like so hard because that would be awesome to just leave that milkweed, but people do not like tall vegetation. It's also important to note that if you tell everyone you want to save the bees, that might not be universally accepted. If you don't provide enough programming on why you want to do that and whether or not it creates a safety risk, people will be fearful, some people. They also will see your sites as potential sources of other wildlife, like perhaps rats or other things like that that they don't want. So communicating with people about why you want to help pollinators, why that's important, whether the bees represent a risk, and being mindful of anyone that's very afraid and not putting sites near them is important too, because for long-term success. So when we think about the different elements that I've talked about today, it's fairly easy to figure out what the bees need. So when we look at things they need to disperse and forage and nest, we can study things like habitat design and landscape context and the pollution load there. But it's harder to do this part, to figure out what people want through their safety, through their aesthetics, what they value in habitats. And so one way we tried to do this in our habitats was by establishing cues to care. Cues to care is a theory that was brought to everyone's attention by Dr. Joan Nassauer at the University of Michigan. And in her cues to care theory, she talks about many elements that we associate with high quality environments that we would want to live around. And I think that this picture of a park in a more affluent neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio, really illustrates many of these things. So people tend to like things with straight borders. They like a lot of color. They like a lot of texture in their gardens. They don't like weeds. They like paths and seating, open trees, lots of green. And so how do you replicate this in an inner city area with very low budgets at the city level, challenges with crime and drug activity, many challenges with litter? Well, it's hard. And even knowing how to do this and having a really pretty big budget, here is my attempt at doing this, right? And so it's not the same thing. And we can't pretend that we're giving people this. So I think the more that you can incorporate the community into designing the habitat, the more people understand how hard it is to even maintain this. So elements that we included were things like a mulch border, a mowed edge, signage. We cleaned up garbage every week. But it still really did not resonate with some residents. We particularly had challenges when people noticed weeds that they were familiar with in the patches, even when there was dense prairie vegetation. We also would receive a lot of phone calls when the prairie was not in bloom in the spring and again in the fall. So we would cut this in October, which maybe isn't ideal for all bird species, but it would turn brown and people would get very upset about that. And so our only recourse was to cut it in the fall. And in the spring, some of our sites every year would be mowed by residents who just thought it was a site the city did not mow, even with the fencing. And it's hard to find something that pleases everybody because when you look around, people have a variety of different aesthetics. And in neighborhoods with a lot of chaos and a lot of vacant land, you find that a lot of people like the serenity and simple, it looks good all the time, value of fake flowers. And you find a tremendous amount of fake flowers near vacant lots, which is an interesting dichotomy. So if you like the clean aspect of never having weeds and having fake flowers, a pocket prairie is the opposite end of the spectrum for you. So aesthetics were a challenge. The other thing that's a challenge that you need to think about if you're going to do this is maintenance. So there's a tremendous problem in vacant lots with people dumping things. And these oftentimes aren't neighbors. One of the big problems we would have is suburban tire companies, instead of paying to recycle, would throw their tires out. I actually witnessed this and turned someone in. So we would have to pull a lot of tires out of these sites. Construction companies and landlords, when they would evict people or redo a house, would also dump a lot of materials like mattresses, old sinks, ceiling tiles, everything in the sites. So we would do, this is a weekly trash removal from like 3 sites. And it was crazy. And once a year, I would also rent a dump truck. And in a year, we would take multiple loads to the dumpster. You also want to maintain signage and sampling equipment, because if things look messy and unkept, that's just going to show the community that, you know, you don't care and you've abandoned the site, even if it just happened. So we would go up every week and ensure that nothing was damaged, all sites were in good order, the signage was there, etc. It's also really hard to find help. So I had 40 of these lots. We had a decent budget, but I had a lot of busy grad students. And I'm one person, so I thought, you know what, I'm not going to mow these myself. I'm going to hire somebody to mow these. It's going to take that off, because we were mowing a border around each site. And then for some of the sites, we were mowing the whole site. So this project ran for 5 years. The first 3 years, I hired 3 different contractors. None of them were capable of mowing a straight line. So this guy, you know, it's like this. This person mowed through the habitat in the late summer instead of along the edge. We'd have people miss parts. It was a disaster. And so the neighbors would call me and say, you know, your mowing company's doing a terrible job. So finally, in the 3rd year, I just bought all my own equipment. So if you do have a position where you can store, you know, a rider tractor or a nice mulching mower or some kind of equipment like that, it's worth it. It's worth it because you have control and can, if someone calls and complains, you can be there the next day and deal with the situation. Probably the hardest thing to deal with was crime, either perceived or actual risks associated with planting this vegetation. So this is a site that I planted and it ended up being in a poor location. So it's on a busy corner and there's a bus stop over here. And so a lot of people are walking in front of this to go to the bus from a neighborhood. And we got an email from a city councilwoman that said that neighbors were afraid to walk to the bus because of the height of the plants. They thought someone might be hiding in the plants, that they would get robbed or worse. And we held a kids event at this same site a couple weeks before I got this email. So this is my grad student, Denisha. So she's probably like 5'6", and 2 kids. So you can see their heads are above the vegetation. It's tall, but it's not tall enough where someone might be able to hide. But even if it's not reasonable that they could hide there, if someone feels that there might be someone in there and they have a perceived fear, then that site is not going to work, right? And there is a lot of crime in this area. Right around the corner, there's a very sad memorial for a high school kid that was shot in this community. So people's fears could be realized. So we removed this site. And this is something to think about in site placement, that you really need to consider whether the vegetation will be a threat to anyone. So how do we incorporate community members? What are some takeaways that we can think about as we move forward in conservation? Well, first of all, it's important to remember that everyone's opinion matters for long-term success, even people who do not care about conserving insects or plants or whatever you're trying to do, because they're going to be vocal once the habitat is there. So you have to get them on board, at least to accept the project. There's a lot of ways we can help bees. So be flexible and find win-win scenarios with the communities that also improve their well-being, improve their ability to appreciate nature, spend time outside, feel connected to a conservation effort. That's very important. And so to do this, you build a team from the onset of the project. It should have neighbors, the city, community leaders. Maybe there's an important church organization or other community group there. You want to have land use planners and conservation experts to help with some of the actual nuts and bolts, like I had those folks planting my habitats. Also consider a long-term plan and budget. So my project was a 7-year run. We had money for that. It was meant to be research and demonstration. It was never meant to be there forever. We had huge tour groups, so we brought through to teach people. I continue to speak about it like this presentation, but we had a budget we knew for 7 years. If you want a project to extend forever, you need a way to continue to fund it, right? And so that's a challenge that you need to think through. And incorporate in that budget management like the trash removal, the mowing, things like that that I talked about. Well, I would like to thank you all for attending. Looks like for once in my life, I've ended at the proper time, so there is time for questions. I want to acknowledge all of our Cleveland residents that work with us, our summer students, all my grad students, our partners, and the funding that made this possible. So thank you very much for attending.
Awesome. Great presentation.
Thank you.
So many cool things. I love your comment there about the cues to care. That's a concept that I've known about for a while. I had never heard that actual term with it. So that's pretty cool. It's, it helps if it looks like it's intentional and it looks like someone does care about it. Yeah, definitely. We definitely got a lot of good comments here in the chat. Chris was saying, love the conservation takeaways, those little nuggets.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And Carla was saying it was good to see questioning of long-term potential impacts of urban pollution. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that those of us in the major cities have to deal with for sure. And then let's see, Chris has a question here related to the October mowing. Does that destroy stem nesting bees?
It could definitely have a negative impact on stem nesting bees and pith nesting bees. Although sometimes when you cut the tops of stems, like for instance, when people cut back brambles, that can also provide an opening for pith nesting bees. So it's hard to say for sure, but it certainly could have a negative impact.
And I noticed there at that end you were talking about one of the youth programs where they had your grad students out with the youth. Did you work with area schools or youth programs? What kind of where were
So
this?
one of the things people always ask is, did you have youth groups in the vacant lots? And for the most part, we did not. The vacant lots have a lot of glass. They have a lot of debris. We did find in some cases, drug paraphernalia in the lots. So they're not great spaces, unfortunately, for schools to go say on their own. So if we would do a program, we would go out the day before and then again in the morning and just make sure everything was like ready to go. So we would do those programs a couple times a year, but it wasn't something where we could do like a weekly program. There
Yeah.
was a really great program, and I think unfortunately it's ended now, but it was for several years in Cleveland where the Cleveland Botanical Gardens hosted youth in their series of urban farms, which they had a lot more manage people out there managing. So there are programs like that in the city, and there's a lot. We're doing a school garden project now where we're planting pollinator gardens at schools, and we're going to build programming on that. So then it's there, it's in their landscape. Their people can make sure it's maintained, and we go to the site. So that's kind of my approach to working with the schools.
Neat. Very cool. I've got there's a national conference for interpreters, for those who work with nature and history stuff that's happening in Cleveland this winter. And I
Oh,
was like,
cool.
man, I'd like to go. I've got to go a different one last year, so not in my budget for this year, but I will have to get up there. A couple more questions. Carla asks, did you assess acceptance in more rural areas, such as in Worcester? Any impacts from ag practices in those areas?
We have never planted, so there are kind of analogous types of habitats in rural areas. So people will sometimes plant wildflower habitats as strips on farms as conservation easements. And so that's something that you see in rural places. Because people tend to own a large amount of land, most likely the person planting that habitat is the only person that really encounters that habitat. So it's doubtful that you would have as many challenges, I think, getting everyone to agree in a rural area. I have in my distant past studied insects in those strips, but it's been a long time.
A few
So,
years, yeah.
yeah.
Awesome. And Chris is asking, did you get any feedback from the city, like such as savings and mowing of lots in the experiment?
The city was very interested in saving money from mowing, and they're also very interested in initiatives that improve the environmental quality of the city. One of their big initiatives is to try to reduce stormwater runoff. And prairie plants, as you guys know, have really deep roots, and so they're used a lot in rain gardening. So they were really excited about it. They have adapted native plant use in some rain gardening projects, but maintaining vacant lots with native plants has just proven too controversial, I think, for the city to deal with. They have a lot on their plate, and this is just too much for them to do, I think. But interestingly, many other cities in Ohio are planting prairies on their vacant lots and are keen to maintain them. So, what has not worked maybe for the city of Cleveland, we've worked with the city of Youngstown, Dayton, and Cincinnati, and all of those cities have put in pocket prairies. We're doing some survey work right now in Youngstown, asking people what cues to care are most important to them in the management of pocket prairies. And I actually just got funded to do a new project in Dayton called a foraging forest. I'm super excited about this. We're going to be planting different tree communities that have things that people can collect and eat or have important food for wildlife. And we're going to be assessing, how those can fit into vacant lots and also assist with climate resilience. So this project has definitely informed a lot of other work in other cities.
Nice, nice. Looks like one more. What's your entomologist opinion of whether honeybees compete with native bees?
Yeah, that can be a controversial one, Chris. So from what the literature I've read, they can definitely compete with native bees in some circumstances. And so when people talk to me about saving the pollinators in an urban area and they want to do so by keeping honeybees, but they're not a professional beekeeper and they're like, oh, this is going to be really expensive to get into, but I'm going to do it to save the bees. I definitely say, you know what? I wouldn't do it. I would plant my yard with pollinator habitat. You're going to provide forage for all kinds of things like hummingbirds and different wild bees. If somebody is a beekeeper themselves and that's their economic way of life, that's a different thing. That's a farmed. So honeybees are a farmed commodity. They're included in the USDA, animals list. And so I very much think about them like a farmed product. And they're very important and they serve an important purpose for people economically and in our food. But in terms of a conservation goal, I would never suggest to somebody to keep them. And it's surprising how many people that's their go-to. So I think it's important for us to educate people about other ways they can go about helping bees.
In other ways that don't require quite as much detail-oriented
Right, and
attention.
and messing, it's a lot. It's a lot.
Those of us who are lazy, yeah.
Right. I'm I would never do that, and I know how to do it. I still wouldn't want to.
Oh, nice. Well, that looks like that might be our last question that we've got, unless anyone has a final one. I think we're good. So thank you, Mary, for your presentation. It was awesome. For those of y'all who want to maybe ask Mary some one-on-one questions, you don't want the whole group around, her office hours are coming up right after this. So just have to hop off and hop on the new link for that one. And just a reminder, I know it's kind of the end of the day, but don't forget to take it just a couple minutes to do your session evaluation for Mary's session. And then, as always, you can check out the recording anytime for the next year. So, all right. Thank you very much, Mary. And everybody have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. I'll see y'all in the chat if folks want to join me.